Corsair Clockworks, Chapter 6, in which free men search and birds loom. The loss of the Magus carrying Garlish allied intelligence was a loss of months of work. The trail from the coasts of Jariat all the way to the center of the Garlish Empire had been grueling, their prey resilient and always one step ahead. He was talented in arcane flight, and in magically creating only what he needed and leaving nothing behind. It had strained their tracker, Osip Alexei Karev, to the point of near collapse, following trails that surely no lesser man could have found. Now it seemed all of it was for nothing. The three of them had found an empty room in a run-down building near the river. Much of the riverfront was in disrepair and filled with the dejected and downtrodden, while during much of their journey the three had taken to wearing all manner of concealment to make their appearances less profound. The people of the riverside paid not a single mind to the three men with shaved heads and eye patches. Their own daily toils and miseries far outweighed the curious sight they made in passing. Peeling paint and dark stone, thick tobacco and thin drink. The smell was not of industry, but decay. A revolution would do Garland more good than its people could possibly imagine. After rechecking the hall, Zakar finally allowed himself to relax. While in their required hiding place, Osip had finally gotten some desperately needed rest, and now sat on a tattered chair checking his equipment. Against the wall, their team leader, Ramsey Dario Zolner, sat on the remnants of what at some point may have been a bed. His head was bowed near his chest, his arms folded. Ramsey had been vital to the infiltration of Garland, being the most fluent in Garlish among them. Although Ramsey would never speak on it, Zakar had been told his mother had been a Garlish immigrant to Suzdal Nurgovod. This was only one of the many things Ramsey would not speak on. Osip looked up at Zakar tiredly, and he idly patted the younger man's shoulder. "It will be good to end the pretense, eh? Returning to ourselves?" In that lethargic manner peculiar to him, Osip smiled lightly. He adjusted the thick bracer that held the mechanisms for their automated Qatari, and with a short flick of his wrist the concealed blade jutted from the bracer sharply. "The sooner we get out of Garland the better. The freemen need us on the front." "I agree. Staying in St. Emile is a waste of time," he added in a grumble. "We should have left the instant the messenger was lost." With a flex of his fingers, the blade returned to its holster. At this, Zakar folded his arms over his wide chest, and he scratched just above his bushy eyebrow. "Do not be hasty, Osip. We must get new orders, and not assume." Osip raised his voice. "Ramsey knew—" Zakar sharply hissed him quiet, and placed a finger against his lips. He motioned with his shaved head to where Ramsey had not moved. Understanding the unspoken command, Osip's lean shoulders slumped. "Ah, he is speaking to our commander, then." He noted a sliver of bitterness. "Watch your ire. It's unbecoming of a soldier." In frustration, he ran a hand over where hair once was. "I can't help it, Zakar. She only knows of strategy on paper, not in the field," he whispered. "Even more unbecoming to openly disrespect a commanding officer." Osip tightened his lips and bowed his head. "I was out of line." On the other side of the room, Ramsey yawned loudly and sat straight. "Though I am inclined to agree with you, Osip." Zakar turned to him and placed his hands on his hips. "Do we have new orders?" "We remain in St. Emile." Osip heaved out a frustrated sigh. In his bitterness, the Qatari unsheathed again. "What is this? It is done. The message is gone. We failed." Zakar clicked his tongue at him angrily. Ramsey stood and began to take off the clothes he had acquired before reaching St. Emile. He yanked off the frill cravat and unbuttoned the vest. "Our commander is convinced there may be a way to save a sliver of the original mission." Ramsey picked up his pack and pulled out the dark threads of his uniform. "The messenger himself is a mage of the Garlish espionage. He will attempt to leave the city to return to the war front. If we take him, we take what he may know." Osip chuckled. "So she is attempting to save face." "He may know nothing," Zakar pointed out. "Nothing of use to the free men. Then he knows nothing." Ramsey, down to his undershirt and pants, readjusted the strap of his Qatari. With a sharp clench of his fist, the blade jutted out, a metallic thunk following the motion. As he reset it, he looked flatly to Zakar. "And we finished the job." The new orders clearly weighed on Osip, yet he buckled like an admirable soldier. The little weasel escaped into the military, he informed rather than complained. Even I would be strained to follow him now. However, we know he has connections in Saint-Emile, Zakhar pointed out. Pulling on his shirt, thick from the extra protection woven into it, Ramsay agreed. Exactly, Nicolain. Our prey is easily lost in the city. His lady friend, on the other hand. If she lives here, I am sure you will find her easier to track. Ossip nodded. Yes, sir. I will find her. Ramsay was never the sort to make any sort of gesture of solidarity, so as he said, I expect nothing less. Zakhar clapped a hand of encouragement on Ossip's shoulder on his behalf. Finally, Ramsay pulled on his uniform's cloak. The color was not exactly black, not exactly blue, but an engineer-refined dye that absorbed more light and made less of a prominent shape. When in full uniform, the men and women of the regiments in which Ramsay Dario Zollner, Ossip Alexei Karev, and Zakhar Avtaikin Nicolain served were simply living smoke, moving through shadows and gloom until nearly on top of an enemy. It was certainly not the striking black, gold, and burgundy livery of Zakhar's youth, but a sign of the times, he supposed. He still felt a swell of pride looking at the three of them in their gear. They were proud soldiers again, rather than simply skulking spies. With that, Ramsay pulled open the window to the Saint-Emile streets and slipped through. We move. They followed, and the Garlish night swallowed them in an instant. Andrea Corsair's existence had taken on a truly surreal flavor the last several days. When Nicholas had returned her to the shop, he had casually come up with logical explanations for her late hour returning, mostly pertaining to his distracting her. He had fabricated an afternoon with the two of them passing by a newfangled automated orchestra wagon, performing in the square, and how between that and conversation time had slipped away. He was deeply apologetic, and told her father he simply couldn't have allowed Andrea to walk home alone. They then shared a few awkward words and chuckles on Andrea's distressing new inability to return home before dark. Now that she was aware of what he looked like when he lied, she found it quite terrifying that there was not even the slightest change. His smile was identical to that of what she had seen so often in the last several years, that arch of his eyebrow no different than his usual self-assured expression. Where did the maid she knew end, and the spymaster begin? Almost as terrifying was Mother's insinuation that while she had encouraged Andrea to start looking for a suitor, and as wealthy and stable in position as Nicholas was, surely Andrea could raise her standards. Thankfully, the expression that Andrea had given her had caused her to sigh in relief. As she had readied herself for bed was when she first noticed a feathered shape. Across the street on the roof of the barrister's office was a bird, staring directly at her window. A lumpy form lay on the roof near it. She was being watched, but for it to be so plainly obvious to her was rather offensive, and she had drawn the curtains with a furious yank. Small wonder Monte Ronan had been followed all the way from Suzdal Nurgovod. In all her years of daydreaming, she had never pictured the adventure that would eventually come to her would only be bursts of sheer unbridled terror, punctuated by dreary banality and disappointment. There had been street thugs, a dashing nobleman, magic, and surely the three most horrific men alive, and then nothing, honestly. The sun came up, chores had to be done. Oh, and word from school had arrived on Andrea's punishment after class, and Andrea had finally received the disappointment and anger of her mother. Thus, her chore duties were tripled for the next week. 3 days had gone by as though absolutely nothing were different. She attended her abysmal classes and performed as usual, abysmally. Her afternoons were filled with house and shop chores, dusting, receipt logging, mopping, polishing, laundry, and cooking. This day she was being forced to ready string beans for dinner. She snapped the stalks in twain after removing the tiny threads at the ends, and despondently dropped them into a bowl. Her elbows propped on the table, her heavy sighs matched the overcast skies and miserable rain that had started the day before. As she snapped, dropped, she felt her attentions waver and drift. If she listened intently, she could catch the slightest sounds. "Where is it?" was the distressed cry her little sister let out from upstairs. She had most likely lost her scarf again, and forgotten that it usually fluttered its way under her bed. "Let me wrap that for you, madame," came from the shop, her mother finalizing a sale. She had a unique way of speaking to customers she used on no one else. A sunniness would trickle in her voice, unlike usual. It was strangely pretty, but a bit too facetious for Andrea. Tack, tick, 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 crick. Ah, that slight, barely audible sound was her father at work. The singing bird was completed, so he had returned to his regular commissions of clocks and music boxes. This was the most pleasing of the sounds Andrea could choose to hear, so she focused on it. However, a set of grumbles much closer than the workshop interrupted. She sighed in frustration and glared at the open window facing the grassy space behind the shop. It was a space shared by the Corsairs and the owners of the other buildings whose backs encircled it. A single tree stood in its center, an old and feeble sentinel of small bearing for its breed. Its twisting branches and green leaves rose and fell from the gentle breeze that accompanied the miserable raindrops, and if one truly looked hard in this tree's base, one might notice a faint outline in the mist. It would be quite a strain, and Andrea more than likely would have had to point it out first, but she was already aware of what watched from that spot. Her guard, such as he was, had focused so intensely on his mission that he had given her barely a moment of privacy. When she had not seen him the first day of her monitoring, she had been delighted that he was at least giving her space. However, after she had noted sounds from mid-air, she had then realized he apparently had a way to make himself untraceable to the eye, even in full daylight. Now she was all too aware of his presence, and it was driving her mad. She had done her best to ignore Monte, that he or his hawk Pascal always seemed to be facing her window when she was getting ready for bed, or that he slunk in the shadows as she and Julia had walked to school, or that sparrows now seemed to be terrified of nearing the shop because of an ever-circling hawk. However, her patience was wearing thin. She spitefully tossed the beans in the bowl and stomped to the kitchen window facing out. "Must you stand directly outside of the window, Mr. Ronan?" The vague shape in the mist wavered, and a voice sputtered, "What? How do you even know I'm here?" "And once again, I must thank my luck. Over a week of perfect weather, and now it decides to rain." She repeated his words back in her best approximation of his flat-voiced griping. She expected him to be angry that she had noticed him, but the air shimmered, and Monty slowly solidified with his wand upheld. The expression he wore was more baffled awe, raising an eyebrow sharply. "How could you have possibly hurt me?" he whispered. The whisper had come from beneath a tree a good 20 feet away, and yet his voice was still clear to her. "That hardly matters," she answered plainly. "You are asked to maintain reasonable surveillance. This is looming." He was clearly flustered, and he folded his arms under his cloak. "If you would stop closing the curtains, I wouldn't have to be so close." "If it wasn't just about how much you despise my privacy, you wouldn't all but breathe down my neck when I'm at market or school," she pointed out, pushing her glasses up her nose in indignation. Now she had obviously pulled the rug out from under him. His eyes widened, and he stammered out several wordless sounds, then finally pushed out, I'd rather be careful than not. Just stop drawing attention to me." Andrea humphed and pointed at the hawk perched on the laundry line. "As though that isn't drawing attention enough. Now, good day, Mr. Ronan." She grabbed the shutters and slammed them shut. "Mother is still furious, isn't she?" Julia said from her bed. Andrea threw a rightfully exhausted and simultaneously impatient glare at her younger sister as she slogged her way into the bedroom and shut the door behind her. Usually she would have more energy to argue, but after just having finished with all the pots and plates, she hardly felt like expending the effort. With a long sigh, Andrea flopped onto her own bed. "Leave me alone," she mumbled into her pillow. "You've been doing so many of the chores this week, I hope you'll get scolded next week, too," she tittered happily. Andrea pulled her face up and then vengefully threw one of her pillows at her. Even despite a solid hit, Julia only swept her perfect golden hair back and laughed. For a moment, she held the pillow as though she'd retaliate, but then noticed the weary look in Andrea's eyes. "Oh, forgive me. It was all just fun. Mrs. Castleberry is such a witch, though, isn't she?" I thought you didn't mind her?" "Of course I mind her. She's wretched," Julia said as she readjusted herself on the bed. "I just smile sweetly and drip admiration, and that takes care of her." "If only it worked with me," she groaned out. "There's nothing I can do right." "I wish someone cared about what you do well at," Julia mused, crossing her legs over her knees. She wished it too, nearly every day. "I'm not really good at anything," she mumbled low. The pillow returned to her at top speed, causing her to jump and her glasses to fly to places unknown. "Never again," Julia snapped. Once this punishment is over, I want you back in Father's shop, and I want nothing like that ever again." Bewildered, Andrea blinked at her. When the silence filled the room long enough, finally she braved a smile and cheerfully stared at her lap. "Never again." Where did my glasses go?" she sighed out. I think behind the vanity." "Julia, those are fragile, you know," she scoffed. "As is your faith by the looks of it." "Hush!" she cut, though a grateful grin ruined it as she fumbled behind the vanity to find her glasses. As Andrea crawled on her knees, Julia offered little assistance other than informing her, "The new serial of the Pirates of Nepta will be out in 2 weeks, Jono tells me." She finally found her spectacles and popped her head back up. While Andrea always loved classic books, the serials were her current passion. Her mother only tolerated she and Julia spending their pocket money on them because she would never touch the things. Dashing pirates, Alvari forests filled with pixies and ancient magics, peasant girls being swept off their feet by brave princes. Oh, surely if she knew where Andrea's daydreams came from, Mother would snatch away every last one and tell her to act her age. "Oh, finally, an end to that cliffhanger," Andrea said happily. "With Deltonius falling off the boat? It's been driving me mad," Julia agreed with a nod. "Although if Wendelin doesn't confess to Ralton, I may lose my mind." "Any word on the next fantastical tales?" "Oh, I was going to surprise you," Julia laughed. "Comes out in 2 days." Her elation at her favorite serial pamphlet coming out was brief. As she stood, she noticed the shape of a hawk perched on the building across the street. Reminded of her conversation earlier, she frowned. She then spitefully shut the window and turned to change into her nightclothes. "Closing the window?" Julia coughed. "In this heat, I think not." Julia stood and threw them open, only drawing the curtains. It's not hot," Andrea insisted and reached to grab for the window. With a sharp twist, Julia planted herself firmly in front of the windowsill and planted her hands against the wall behind her. "No! Enough is enough, Andrea. You've closed the windows the last 3 days. I'll not be waking in a pool of sweat, thank you." It's important," she blurted. "Just move. Not for the Emperor's fortune. You're being childish." "Me?" she laughed sharply, her sparkling green eyes burrowing into her. "Give me one good reason this window should stay closed in midsummer, and I might relent." But Andrea's eyes darted around the room. Then she croaked out the first word that came to her head. "Birds." Julia's arms flopped to her side, and she stared at Andrea, dumbstruck. "Birds. You're afraid of birds coming into the room. I've just heard stories of late." She rushed out furiously, ashamed that this was what she had committed herself to. Coming in and stealing trinkets and mussing with ladies' hair." The stuttering was giving her away, and Julia only pointed at Andrea's bed meaningfully. "I'm not lying," she insisted. "I heard in the marketplace that some of the ladies saw their best bits of jewelry stolen." "Change," Julia said dourly. "Then bed. No birds." Morning arrived with the largest downpour yet. The combination of the hot air and chilly water was a disgusting one. In addition, the dominant winds came from the direction of the river, leaving a none-too-pleasant scent in the air all the way to the artisan districts. Andrea returned home from school first, and finally the sniffling and wheezing sounds she kept hearing behind her caused her to pause and her shoulders to slump. "I suppose you should find your spot for the rest of today." The only reply was a very audible sneeze from the empty air behind her. She sighed and stepped into the shop. Her mother was thankfully too busy with a customer, so she was able to slip into the house and into the kitchen. The last portions of the soup from the day before were on the stove, and after a quick check to ensure no one was likely to see her, she quickly prepared a bowl of the potato and green bean stew, a roll, and some of the salted fish they kept in the pantry, along with a cup of tea. With her umbrella hooked between her neck and shoulder, she stepped out into the courtyard and strolled to the tree with her arms laden. As she guessed, a single spot under the tree had a patch that looked suspiciously dry despite the rain. She firmly placed the tray in front of it, then stood back and took hold of her umbrella properly. "There," she said to the air. "I didn't ask for... The air interrupted itself with another sneeze and a loud sniffle. "No, you didn't," she agreed. "But I didn't ask you to sit in the rain day in and day out, yet here we are." Is that fish for Pascal? I assumed he would want something. Thank you. Is there any form of magic good at colds? The tray of food vanished, all save the fish, which was set aside on the ground. No, he grumbled out stuffily. Or at least none that I'm good at. Well, if this is going to continue, you should do something about it. Tomorrow. She sighed and rolled her eyes, then glanced up as Pascal finally fluttered his way to the ground. Awkwardly, the raptor hobbled on its legs to the pile of fish. Then she could swear it looked to her and bowed in thanks. She was left speechless as it calmly began eating, tearing pieces and swallowing them down. She thought for a moment on asking how intelligent familiars were, but decided it was time to get to her chores before Mother noticed. As she turned to go back in the house, she paused to see Julia standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Julia's eyes were locked squarely on Pascal, her jaw hanging open. Oh dear, how much had Julia seen? Had she seen the tray? Andrea had to say something to cover up Monte. You see, she rushed out. Birds. Julia gawked at her, then ran into the kitchen. Andrea heard the sound of rapidly closing windows in her wake. Julia has closed every window in the house, Papa noted as he sat at the dinner table. It's getting terribly stuffy. Every time I try to open them, she shouts something about birds and closes them again, Mama said with a bewildered shrug. They're not getting in, Julia huffed out, finally joining them at the table. Well, I suppose if you saw something, I can't argue with you, Papa sighed out, dabbing his forehead with a napkin. Lots of strange occurrences as of late. Speaking of such, there's a puzzling hole in my work table, and when I looked up, I saw another one in the ceiling. Andrea stared into her soup, recalling the searing liquid that had guarded the magical message. What, was there a malfunction with a tool? Well, that would explain the hole in the table, certainly. But the ceiling? He pressed. The two holes line up perfectly, as though it came from the room above. Actually, I think that would be in your room. You haven't seen anything odd. She shrugged innocently. Julia shook her head too. Apparently she hadn't noticed the hole in the vanity Andrea had covered. Strangest thing, he sighed in resignation. Mama quietly ate her soup, then after swallowing, cleared her throat lightly. Andrea, I think you've learned your lesson. Andrea sat up straight and tall, a weight taken off of her shoulders. You mean it? Have a day off tomorrow, she said with a gentle smile. It'll be Julia's turn in the shop. Couldn't you punish her just one more day? Julia pleaded. I was counting on it to be able to go out tomorrow. Mama stared flatly at Julia, and she heaved out an overdramatic sigh. Fine, I suppose I'll just let Becca know I can't. Andrea smiled warmly at Julia. Usually she would have expected a much larger protest than that. Thank you so much, Mother. You've been working very hard, she affirmed. And I'm sure things are getting better at school, her father offered. Andrea grimaced painfully, and thankfully Julia jumped in. I would promise her I would help her since I do so well. There we have it, Father said with finality. So have a rest tomorrow. No school the next day, and no punishments either? What a blessed relief. What would she do? She pondered as they chatted and ate. Well, no matter what she did, her shadow would be close behind. Oh, wait. He would be going to handle his cold. There might be a window of opportunity for her to finally have some privacy. Using it to go to market or the squares was not safe. She understood that. While tired of Monte looming, she wasn't a fool. Simply staying home was such a waste. Her mind drifted to the first time she had met her slovenly watchdog. How completely unconcerned with her he had been when he hadn't been ordered to do so. He had barely looked her in the eye, if she recalled correctly. Even if willing to stand guard until ill, none of it was genuine. This train of thought led her to the gentleman who had actually offered a hand in aid, Sir Alan Ventaris. She had done her best not to dwell on him since, those sparkling green and brown eyes or his gentle smile. For just a moment she had felt something pass between them, a connection when an airship had passed over. How earnestly he had spoken on his desire to aid the war effort, a knight to his very core. Something struck her, and a bubbling excitement rose within her. Alan had been longing to serve the effort, yet was trapped at home. Andrea was herself vital to the cause, important information locked in her mind until retrieved. Surely, what more noble cause could there be to Garland and its allies within Saint Emile? He would jump at the chance to escort her. And if their emotion grew close by pure proximity, then goodness, what a pleasant surprise that would be. A dashing knight and a damsel in distress? It was simply too perfect for it to never happen.
Corsair Clockworks is an Ever Tomorrow production, plot by Jessie Lynn Jones and Marlon de Rivera, and written and performed by Jessie Lynn Jones. For more audio fiction, click the links and subscribe today so you'll always be ready for the next chapter.